Hello, beautiful people, and welcome, to the Genshin Impact 4.3 Meta Roundup. This Abyss is a bit of a step down in difficulty from last Abyss. It is overall a decent amount easier, but it's also, in some ways, a bit more restrictive in terms of the teams you can play. Whereas in the last Abyss, you could kind of just play any team and then slot in a Hydro unit for shield breaking, or even not even a Hydro unit. You could also just do 2 Electro units or anything like that, right? In this Abyss, you're a little bit more restricted in 2 ways. One, you've got some Geo immune enemies that also have Geo shields, which can be a bit of a pain in the ass. And you have, more importantly, the Hydro Tulpa, which is immune to Hydro damage. This does somewhat limit the sort of teams that you can bring in the first half, and slightly restrict the teams that are good in the second half. On top of that, you also have the Thunder Manifestation, which is immune to electro damage. I think that while this Abyss is overall a decent amount easier than the last one, it is possible that depending on the characters you have invested, you might actually find it more difficult because of those restrictions. The Tulpa is the tankiest enemy we've ever had in Abyss. It has a total of a little bit over 3 million HP. The previous tankiest was the Primo Geovishap, which was at about 2.75 million HP. But if you take proper advantage of the Hydro Aura, it can actually be easier to kill than other bosses. In any case, in the first chamber, you have the PMA on the first half and the Thunder Manifestation on the second half. In the second chamber, you have one mech, the Pyro mech, the one that does followed by 1 Ruin Guard, followed by 2 Ruin Graders. On the second half, you have 3 Geo Slimes with 2 Geo Specters, followed by 2 Geovishaps, followed by 2 Lawa Churls. And then in chamber 3, you have the Hydro Tulpa by itself. And then on the second half, you have 2 Lawa Churls, followed by 1 Lore Master and 1 Ring Dancer. What does this mean overall for which teams are gonna be better or worse? Well, for the first half, chamber 1, it's a single target boss. Chamber 2, it's single target enemy, followed by single target enemy, followed by AoE, but with 2 enemies that group themselves up fairly close to each other, which means that even characters that don't have the best AoE, as long as they have a little bit of AoE, will be able to hit both. On top of that, they're just not that tanky, so even if you have no AoE whatsoever, it shouldn't be that big of a deal. And then in chamber 3, you have a single target boss that is immune to an element and favors some team archetypes because it's always infused with Hydro. Basically, the first slide is very single target favored, and specifically Vape Teams that can take proper advantage of the Tulpa's Hydro Infusion will benefit a lot. But when I say Vape Teams, I don't necessarily actually mean Vape Teams. Any team that has Pyro units becomes a Vape Team against the Tulpa, and your Hydro units become more or less useless. At least their damage on Hydro application becomes useless against the Tulpa. And so what that means is teams like Mono Pyro, for example, effectively are significantly stronger against the Tulpa because they just get to vape for free. How are other archetypes affected by this Hydro? So Hyperbloom teams will be somewhat buffed and also nerfed. So Hyperbloom teams generally have a decent amount of damage coming from the Hydro character's talent damage, and that damage is completely gone against Tulpa. And it favors maybe double Dendro Hyperbloom teams, for example, because you get to have a lot more seed generation. It favors weird Quicken Hyperbloom mixes where you basically play a Quicken team that has a dedicated Hyperbloom trigger, so that once you get to the Tulpa, you still have your trigger, right? So for example, you can play an Ahytham team that is a Quicken Ahytham team with something like Ahytham, Nahida, Kuki, Fischl or Beidou or Zhongli, like a defensive slot, or maybe even triple Dendro with Baiju or Yao Yao. And then once you get to the last chamber, well, that Kuki that was just there for Quicken is now a Hyperbloom trigger. And so you would want to build her for full EM, sacrificing a little bit of her damage in the first 2 chambers, because obviously if you're building full EM rather than an EM damage crit, right, you're going to do less damage on your aggravates. And also maybe you're sacrificing a bit of healing because some Kuki players or some Alhaitham players like running Kuki on actual healing builds in those Quicken teams, or maybe on Instructor, which tends to have lower stats overall, right? So you're sacrificing a little bit of damage on chambers 1 and 2 in order to get more damage on your chamber 3. You can also just use a Hydro unit in the last slot if you think that you can get through the Tulpa with a 3-unit team. Another thing that you can do, for example, is play a Nilou team. In Nilou teams, usually you have one element that's going to be the dedicated trigger and one element that's the dedicated aura. And it's usually Dendro being the aura and Hydro being the trigger, because that tends to get you more bloom. But against the Tulpa, well, your Hydros aren't doing shit. So you would need your Dendro units to be built with EM in order to take full advantage of their damage. Outside of that, you can also obviously play any of the Burgeon or Hyperbloom archetypes, which are good enough to hold their own. And it's fairly decent on the first side, although the Burgeon archetypes tend to be a little bit better on this second side. You can play Electro carries for Aggravate stuff, but you kind of end up with in an awkward situation against the Tulpa where you can't get Quicken. Now you can trigger the Quicken reaction because when you apply Electro to the Tulpa, you can have Electro Charge on the Tulpa, and then if you apply Dendro onto that, it will trigger both Bloom and Quicken, but triggering Quicken is not what deals damage. It's triggering Aggravate and Spread. And in order to trigger Aggravate and Spread, you need the Quicken aura to be on the enemy. And the Quicken aura will never stay on Tulpa because you'd have to get rid of the Hydro aura, and that's not going to happen. And so you end up losing out on a lot of potential Aggravate damage, but in exchange for that, you potentially get more Hyperblooms. And so you can look at Aggravate teams and build your Aggravate carries maybe with a little bit more EM than you usually would, so that their Hyperblooms hurt a bit more, depending on the sort of application that you have from your Dendro units. Overall, they're all right, although I do believe that there are some other teams that tend to work a little bit better for this. Freeze is not the greatest this Abyss. It works out pretty well on the second half if you can get past the Thunder Manifestation, which obviously can be a bit annoying because it's not freezable, and you can't have Cryo as an aura, so you lose out on Cryo Resonance and potentially Blizzard Strayer. But it's still, like, if you get past the first chamber, the rest is not very difficult. And the first chamber, I would say, tends to be the easiest of the three. So having a team that has a poor matchup on the first chamber isn't that big of a deal. Mono Hydro, I mean, why? Definitely not something you should play on the first side, but it'll work out fairly well on the second side. Outside of that, I mean, you have obviously Taser, which is not very good this Abyss. Taser tends to rely on all of your units' damage, so once you start losing either the Hydro or the Electro portion of your damage, it becomes a lot worse. A lot of Taser's value tends to come from the utility that you get from it, keeping the enemies Electro Charged and staggered all the time, and that just doesn't matter that much against bosses or against these mostly irrelevant enemies, right? That just don't tend to be too much of a problem. And then we get into the Blessing of the Abyssal Moon, which is that when you obtain an elemental shard created by Crystallize, you gain 15% increased damage up to 3 times. This blessing gives a pretty good amount of damage to teams that can slot in Geo. So that means that Xiangling in general will be a much better thing to include in general in your teams, especially against the Tulpa, where you get free crystallizes just from it being always infused, right? So you don't have to worry about auras. But that leads us into our Geo teams with both Ito and Navia or Noelle. Do not play them on the second side because, again, Geo Slimes and Geo Specters are immune to Geo damage, and Geo Vishats and Stonehide Lava Trolls have fairly high Geo resistance. You're not going to have the greatest time unless you're playing maybe a Navia team that has Xiangling or Farina, where they're doing a good amount of personal damage and you can get through that, but it's still not going to be ideal. Whereas you can play them on the first side with basically no issues, so that's generally what I'd recommend. Definitely more of a first side thing for the Geo Focus teams, but slotting in a Geo unit like Zhongli, like Albedo, onto your second side, both to deal with the Geo Slime shields and just to get you this blessing, is fairly alright. Navia is very good this Abyss because this blessing is pretty significant and you're basically keeping full uptime on all of it because Navia's kit is centered around getting those crystallizers anyways. Ito, maybe not quite as good because a lot of Ito's teams don't tend to generate that many crystallizers. That being said, against the Tulpa, that doesn't matter because you don't need to worry about the aura, so it'll still be pretty alright. Now to get into like a little bit more specifics on which units do specifically well or specifically poorly, there's a few outliers that I want to talk about. I don't really know what what to call them other than like vulnerable carries. The carries that tend to run shields in order to not be annoyed by bullshit because they don't really want to just dash at any given time, right? So for example, Wanderer, who can get free dashes that don't cost him his like special stamina, but you can't get 2 in a row, right? Like you only get them after a few attacks. Or Yoimiya, who can lose a lot of damage if you like cancel her combo a little bit early. These characters are both good and bad this Abyss, in the sense that both of them have a way that they can work around the Tulpa's aggressive attack patterns, but also if you don't do that very well, they are not going to be pleasant to play in this Abyss, especially because both of them tend to somewhat like using Bennett in their teams. And when you use Bennett against the Hydro Tulpa, his attacks go from doing about 7 to 9k damage to 14 to 18k damage because it's doubled, because it's vaping on you. And that can be enough to one-shot a character, or pretty easily one-shot a shield. With Yoimiya, you can try to go at the right range where you're still in range to attack it, but you're out of range of most of its melee attacks. It's not a perfect solution because you're gonna have the small little guys spawning all over the place, which can kind of cover your attacks going on the boss properly, but it is a solution. With Wanderer, you can kind of do the same thing, but what I've found to be nicer is, well, the Hydro Tulpa is Hydro, which means that you get the Hydro bonus if you use your E close to it, right? That Wanderer gets, which you usually don't get in most Wanderer teams. That gives you a point cap for his like special stamina. Now, usually this doesn't matter too much because your buffs tend to run out towards the end of your stamina anyways. But in this specific case, this additional stamina can be used to just hover even higher, right? You input a jump and it makes you go even higher. And that can actually be high enough that the ground attacks from the Tulpa, most of the ground attacks from the Tulpa won't actually hit you. And then because of the weird shape of the Tulpa, if you go forward at the right angles / the right moment while attacking, you can gain even more height through like the Tulpa's hitbox not being straight. Like it's like this in some places. So you just... and you gain even more height, and you can dodge a very good portion of its attacks. And the additional point cap that you get from the Hydro is pretty useful. It lets you get that jump without losing too much damage. And so if you're doing these things, then it's not too bad for them, and they're pretty good because obviously they're a bit more single target focused, but it is something that you should keep in mind. I mean, I just want to talk about Bennett in general. Like, Bennett will make it a lot harder to survive against the Tulpa. I think that most of the Tulpa's attacks, once you've done it like 10 plus times, are telegraphed well enough that they're all dodgeable. But some of them, based on like the visual indicators, the actual damage happens at a different interval from the visual indicators of the attacks happening for a few of the different attacks. So initially going into it, specifically the second attack of its combo happens earlier than the others. So you're probably going to get hit by that one a few times, and it hurts. Through Bennett buff especially, it hurts a lot. However, a lot of the teams that use Bennett can do really well against the Tulpa, so that can be a worthwhile trade-off. Another character that's worth mentioning is Xingqiu, who isn't doing shit against the Tulpa, but his damage reduction and just inherent synergy with a lot of teams that use Bennett means that if your team is strong enough, you can play just a normal Vape team with Xingqiu in Chambers 1 and 2 and use the the damage reduction you get from Xingqiu as a way to not get one shot through Bennett's burst when the Tulpa hits you. The final specific character I want to mention is the true star of this Abyss, and that's Xiangling. Now you might be thinking, what do you mean, the star of this Abyss? Xiangling's always the star. And like, yeah, you're right, but here's the thing. Xiangling in this Abyss is significantly better than usual. Now, some of you may not know, but the way that Xiangling's burst works, it doesn't just do the damage once per rotation. It checks if there are enemies with hitboxes overlapping on the Pyronado, and if there are, it deals damage to them. And once it's done damage, it goes on cooldown for that enemy for a few frames. I don't know exactly how long it is, but it seems to be like about half a second, maybe a little bit less. But what that means is that if your Pyronado stays inside the enemy's hitbox for longer than that cooldown, then it's going to deal the damage again on the same rotation. Let's show it against the Primo Bishop. Right, these 3002 and 8000, right? They're happening more often than once per rotation. and like once per spin. Because the boss's hitbox is big enough that it's still in the hitbox when the cooldown expires for this enemy. The thing is, the Tulpa is also big enough for that. And the Tulpa has an inherent Hydro Aura, which means that every single one of those hits will vape. This leads to Xiangling just kind of going fucking crazy and doing almost twice the damage that she would usually do. From my testing, I would expect that if you're somewhat mindful of it and you try to keep the Pyronado inside the boss hitbox, you can get about 22 hits reliably. And if you're not really paying attention to it, you'll probably get about 19 or 20. Now, compared to the around 12 that you usually get, that's a big fucking increase. We can't show it in Overworld. When you fight the Tulpa in Overworld, the arena in which you're fighting Tulpa, it's water, right? There's a little bit of water, a little layer of water on top of the ground, which means that you're always applied with Hydro. What that means is when you drop Guoba down, it gets applied with Hydro. And what that means is you can't do a Guoba swirl, which is swirling Guoba's self-pyro infusion that usually happens when you use Guoba, right? You can see that Guoba turns red when he's attacking because he gets pyro infused. And Sucrose's E can swirl that pyro onto enemies and trigger VV. You can't do that in Overworld, but in Abyss, there's no water on the ground, so you can. If you don't want to use Sucrose, Jean can do a similar thing with Bennett, which is the Sunfire interaction, which swirls pyro from your character onto the enemies rather than from Guoba onto the enemies. Although Jean does not give you the pretty big EM buff that Sucrose does. What this means is Xiangling is really fucking good this Abyss. Much more than usual. And so, as usual, we're gonna go through Abyss, showing 2 teams. And to emphasize how good Xiangling is this Abyss, I'm gonna play a mono pyro cope Xiangling, in the sense that I'm not gonna have a pyro carry other than Xiangling, which is usually not really what you want to be doing, but I just really want to show how good it is against the Tulpa. So I'm going to be using Bennett, Xiangling, Zhongli, Sucrose, and then on the other side, we're going to be playing an Oven team, because I like Oven and I think it's fun, and I like playing Kea. Kea is one of the characters that I find the most fun to play in general, so I like having reasons to play him. Now, obviously, this team is not an incredibly good team in general, which means that Chambers 1 and 2 will not be the most impressive. I mean, if you want to do this team optimally, you'd probably just use Bennett on a carry build, right? And like on-field him, but that's kind of boring. But yeah, so Chambers 1 and 2, I'm not expecting anything too crazy, but you'll see what I mean on Chamber 3. And keep in mind, while my builds are fine, I also don't have the most amazing builds, and I don't try to get the most amazing builds because I wanna have builds that are close enough to what you can expect, even with pretty bad RNG on your stuff. Anyways, let's go through a few tips for this Abyss. So, first enemy is the PMA. PMA is actually pretty simple in terms of its attack patterns. It has 2 main attacks. One of them where it goes up, and one of them where it doesn't. The attack where it goes up is a 3-hit combo that can potentially skip the first 2 hits. So the first hit is the spinny thing, then it's like a sword thing, and then it's the one you just saw where he goes up. That's his first attack. His second attack, he just marks where you are and shoots. He also has other attacks when you stand far from it, but that's not something you should do, so he'll never really do them. He'll really only do those 2 attacks mainly. If you have teams that require the boss not to move, like Ayaka for example, I recommend waiting to see what the first attack is. So we got the one where he doesn't move. That means that the next one is going to be the attack where he does move. We get a lucky only 1 hit. The next one is going to be the one where he doesn't move again. He's gonna shoot at me. He's gonna be like, ooh, hit me. Oi! I think I broke it. Bosses kind of react weirdly when you're not hitting them, so I'll just like be hitting him slightly. Okay, so he starts with a triple hit this time, right? The whirly thing, followed by the sword, followed by the go up. That means that the next one is going to be the one where he just shoots in place. And then he'll do the triple hit combo again. Yep. But he only does 2 hits this time. And after he's done 4 attacks, or after you get him below a certain amount of HP, or if he stalls for some of his attacks after a certain time, he's gonna split and go into 4 different enemies, and one of them is gonna be marked. Now, which one is marked is random, and the best one to be marked is this one. So let's go over what you should do based on each one that is marked. So if it's the Dorito, all you have to do is you go somewhere here, because the Dorito's first attack is always this one, if you're close enough to it, and it just dashes right next to the PMA, and then you can start killing it, and it'll be very easy to start damaging the PMA once you've killed the Dorito. If you get the jellyfish, it just stays there for a little bit, and then it walks towards you, so you just want to wait here. If you get the crab, you want to be far enough away that it can do this jump attack while being close to here. Sometimes it won't do it. If it doesn't do it, then it's not going to do it for a while, so you just go towards it and you start hitting it. And very similarly, if you get the snake, you want to be close to the PMA and hope that the snake does this attack where he burrows and goes onto you. And if he doesn't do it, you can just go forward towards it and start hitting it. The reason why the Dorito is the best is because it's both the easiest to group and the fastest to group and the squishiest of the summons. And so if you're struggling with this chamber and like you're really struggling to meet your timer, then resetting until you get the Dorito can be a way that you can cheat out some additional time. Anyways, let's try to get through it. Oh, I missed my E. But yeah, like I said, right, this team is very much a Tulpa team and not much else, right? So you shouldn't be expecting stuff that is too incredibly impressive in the first 2 chambers. But anyways, now we see which enemy we have. We have the Dorito. We got lucky. So we just go here. Don't attack it, because if you attack it, you can disable it, and then it's not going to dash backwards. And then you just start hitting it. Hopefully you kill it fast enough that it doesn't dash again, which shouldn't be too hard because it takes a while to dash again. And then you just go start hitting this. Don't really want to use bursts again, and we have more than enough time to spare, so we don't have to. Next, you have Thunder Manifestation. Now, there's something that's not all that widely known about Thunder Manifestation, which is that there is a way to prevent it from ever moving. It's just kind of difficult. I'll try my best to show it, but it is very possible that I f it up. The Thunder Manifestation doesn't actually start hitting you. Like, it doesn't actually start doing the attacks where it moves until it hits you for the first time. But it has some attacks that are kind of cringe and that are pretty hard to dodge. And it also just has attacks that are not very telegraphed. But yeah, as long as you don't get hit by any of these attacks... Oops, I got hit. Now I got marked, which means that he's gonna start doing his other set of attacks. And it's not just taking damage to it, it's getting hit at all, which means that if you burst iframe, you will still be marked. So that's another way where you can potentially get some more time if this is a chamber you're struggling with. If you play well enough not to get hit by any of its attacks, it's not gonna move at all, which is gonna make it a lot easier to kill it. Yeah, if I remember correctly, the attack that's like really hard to dodge is the one that happens once it gets angry. Like now, yeah, this one. Right, it's one once this bar fills up right here, he gets angry and the attack becomes a lot harder to dodge. Anyways, we just take care of him very quickly and move on to the next chamber. Here, we have the annoying enemy Xiangling. Now, this guy is a huge pain in the ass. You're gonna notice he just doesn't hit me here, because that attack only deals damage if you're far enough away from its body for the wheel to visually hit you. So it's fine. But this attack is a massive pain in the ass because it's pretty good at staggering. And so if you don't have a good source of resistance to interruption, you're just gonna get staggered over and over and you won't really be able to move. And it's very annoying. But you just dispatch it like you usually do. If you get hit by the attack, it's gonna stop moving. So you ideally want to try to dash backwards so that it hits you. But that's not necessary, it's just a thing that makes it a bit less annoying. We're gonna try to keep the hitbox inside, cheat out a little bit of additional damage. I'm gonna use Johnny Burst here because I don't want to set up again on this one, an enemy with such low health. Alright, and here we're gonna try to do it again. And finally, after this Ruin Guard dies, you get 2 Ruin Raiders. Now, if you go far enough away from them at the beginning, they have a 50-50 chance to dash or to do that range attack, after which they'll run towards you. So this is one of the ways you can group them. Or you can just stand in between the 2 of them, in which case both of them will do melee attacks, and neither of them will start running. The running attack can be very annoying because they don't stop running once they hit you, they just keep running until they reach a wall. So if you don't cancel the attack by hitting their feet as they start it, they'll ungroup themselves and you'll lose a lot of time, which is very unfortunate. Okay, here I'm trying to take advantage of the blessing with Zhongli, picking up the crystals to increase my Xiangling damage. And here I accidentally f***ed up. I was too far away from him, and so he did the run attack, but I noticed it, and I walked into him as soon as I could to cancel the attack with, or to cancel the run by attacking his feet. Now they're properly grouped. You just unleash the damage, and the chamber will be over. Now, in this chamber, we start with the slimes and the specters. Now, ideally, you want to have a blunt attack to get rid of the Geo shields. But, as you can see, my team doesn't really have blunt attacks. Because it's not actually necessary to have a blunt attack. You can break the shields just through damage. Now, if you have a way to break the shields very easily, you can just go into them and start hitting them. But if you don't, I would recommend trying to group the slimes before you start hitting them. And so, you just walk towards the wall. Their first attack will be one where they launch things. After that, they'll launch themselves. Oops. So here, they're fairly grouped. And just through dealing damage with my Burgeons, I'm breaking the shields and want to make sure that I kill them before they regenerate their shields once the shield is broken. Otherwise, that's a huge amount of time lost. But once that's done, we just move on to the Geo shops. You can try to stand in the middle of them so that neither of them jump, or close enough or far enough from them so that both of them jump. But I just don't find that to be necessarily worth just waiting, and so I just generally go into one of them. And then finally, the Lawa Charles, which don't really have very abusable attack patterns, so you just group them by just standing on one of them and attacking it. And you just hit them until they die. Finally, we have the Tulpa. And as you can see, I'm vaping for 91k, more than 1 time per rotation, and I'm doing over half of the Tulpa's health in 1 Xiangling burst, which means I just need 2 of them to kill it. I think I fucked up my Globus Swirl, but it doesn't even matter. Because it's just dead. And this is what I mean. The Xiangling is really fucking good this. This is not a particularly good Xiangling team. You would much rather replace Zhongli with another Pyro unit that can be on-fielded for your Mono Pyro. But Xiangling is so strong against the Tulpa that it just doesn't really matter. Now, let's talk about its mechanics very quickly. It'll start with I'm not sure if it's always a 3-hit combo. Okay. It has the attack where it plunges, and then it has a 3-hit combo. Well, yeah, with the second hit hitting a bit faster than the other 2. After it's done 2 attacks, it'll do this one, where you just have to stay out of the big circles. The small circles deal damage as well, but it's not that much. Oops. Eventually, it'll go to one of the corners and do a range attack, which you can dodge just by being close to him. And you want to make sure that you break those mini tulpas as soon as possible, because if you don't break them, he'll go towards them and he'll start absorbing them. And once he does, he becomes bigger, he gains significantly increased resistances, and does a lot more damage. Right, 9.5k instead of the around 7k from earlier. But that, like, infusion, absorption, whatever you want to call it, does not last for very long, so it's not that big of a deal if it happens. Just something to stay on the lookout for. And you can cancel the absorption by destroying the tulpa, the mini tulpa, right as it's trying to absorb it. But yeah, some of the attacks are pretty difficult to dodge, but with enough practice, you can kinda get used to all of them. Here I got hit by the first one, but it's not quite enough to break through my Zhongli shield. I don't think I prevented him from absorbing, but it doesn't really matter. I'll show my Xiangling build after this, don't worry. And I have a good Xiangling build, but it's not an, like, insane, unrealistic one. This is just basically, we're playing Sucrose. So we have VV, we have Sucrose's EM sharing, we have TTDS, we have Zhongli resistance shred, and TOM. You're stacking just a lot of shit onto that Xiangling. I also have C6 Bennett, which gives her some pyro damage. Anyways, and then finally, on the last chamber, it starts with 2 Electrolawitrills. I find that the best way to group them is to just go here. If you have abilities you can precast, you can do that. And then use a burst to iframe while they jump. And then you just start bashing on them. They're like, they stay grouped for a bit after that first jump. Which makes it very easy to kill them. After that, you want to target the Dendro one. Because the Pyro one has a chance to, or the Pyro one will teleport to you after a bit. Oops. My bad. The Pyro one will teleport to you after a bit, which is going to effectively group them. But they're actually squishy enough that it's very possible you kill their summons before they group. And if you do, then they're not going to group. It's fine. I wanted to hold. It's fine. Okay. This was scuffed, but that's okay. Alright, so I've already killed both of the things, so they're not going to group. But it doesn't really matter because they're pretty squishy. So even if they don't group, you just kill them. And that's that. Hopefully this has been somewhat helpful. I do think that they've done a pretty decent job of making an Abyss that showcases Navia's strengths. She is very good on the first side in this Abyss. I would not try to play her on the second side, obviously, because of the annoyances you're gonna encounter with the Geo enemies. I think overall, the Tulpa is the hardest of the enemies. And so I think it tends to be worth it building your team around this chamber. And also overall, the second half tends to be fairly easy. So it tends to be a bit more valuable putting your stronger team on the first side. If you're struggling just not to die, you can consider taking out Bennett, running more defensive utility units. Even ones that lose a lot of value against the Tulpa, like Xingqiu, can still be useful for their defensive utility. Okay, here are the builds I was using. My Xiangling's overall stats, 64 crit rate, 176 crit damage. That being said, that's because I used Deathmatch, because I did not fish for the catch. We don't talk about that. Catch is also very good. My overall artifact stats are fairly good, but nothing unrealistic. The CV I'm getting, it is not the greatest, but a lot of the artifact quality that I I have on my Xiangling comes from the non-CV roles. This Feather, for example, this has a lot of ER. But I do want to mention, I have a lot more ER than I actually need on my Xiangling. In that team specifically, I could very easily just replace this ER sense for an EM sense or an attack sense, and I'd still have enough ER because it's a team where I'm just, on-fielding Bennett while Xiangling is going, so I can generate a lot of particles. So I probably could have reached over 100k on the Pyronados if I really felt like it. I just like having more ER than I actually need because it's just more comfortable. When you kill enemies before your rotation is over, if you don't have more ER than you need, it's just cringe on the next chamber. If you're struggling to reach the DPS checks, then you can very easily get away with a bit less. I'd say 170-ish should be fine if you're running Fav Zhongli and you're actually battering well with Bennett. Bennett build on 250 ER, which is a lot more than you need. Like I said, if you're playing this team optimally, you're probably building Bennett on like 4-piece Crimson Witch or 4-piece Lava Walker and just actually trying to deal damage with him. But I was too lazy to change his build. Zhongli on TOM. Now, you can use Petra because this team is so good against Tulpa that getting better damage against, well, the rest may be more valuable than 20% attack against Tulpa. I do like going TOM anyways, though, because the shield strength is actually very relevant against Tulpa. You're standing inside Bennett Burst, so you can get hit pretty hard. You could also go Instructor Zhongli if you're really trying to maximize Tulpa, but I think Tenacity is a very nice middle ground where you're buffing your team against the non-Tulpa enemies while also buffing against Tulpa and having a stronger shield. He's obviously on 5 as he should be, with just as much crit rate and HP as I can. And then Sucrose, TTDS, probably be level, but it doesn't really matter. 4-piece VV. We don't look at those talents with a total of. That is not right. My bad. She should have more more EM than that. This is the build she should have been on at around 700 EM, but she was closer to about 400. Oops. That's it for this team. The other team, which was an oven team, which again ended up taking advantage of the curry interaction, which, I mean, if you're lost a little bit, lost in the sauce with these names. Actually, I'm pretty sure I have a video about Toma that I posted early on in Sumeru, where the thumbnail is like Toma on a train that covers curry, which is effectively using Electro as a way to generate more seeds in your Burgeon team. But you end up using the Electro that the Thundering Manifestation always has infused on it in order to take advantage of that interaction, even without having to put an Electro unit on your team. And then we use Oven, which is a Burgeon team with Cryo, for the rest of the chambers. For the builds, my Toma is at around 700 EM, 40 crit rate, 175 ER on Fav. Ideally, you want him on Kitane, but I don't have it because I don't want to do the quest. Gilded or flop, but either works. You can even go 2-piece. Kea, just on a traditional Blizzard Trader build. I think Emblem should be better because you're not getting the best freeze up time, but I didn't bother changing his build. I like the Fav sword. Again, I don't really think you need the ER from Fav. It helps make things more comfortable, especially when you kill enemies before your rotation is over. Specifically in this team, I found that the rotations are very flexible, and when you do flexible rotations, when you're not really paying attention to like when you use specific skills, especially because Toma's skill has a 15-second cooldown that can get reduced with his CU1, you end up with some weird overlap in your rotations, or sometimes you don't actually use the same amount of skills in each rotation. And having more ER than you need allows you to do that without having to think about it too much, which I kind of like. But yeah. Nahida is on Fav. You could use Baiju in this team, or use Nahida on Prototype Amber if you find that you're struggling with damage over your rotations or over your chambers, where like in the 3rd chamber you find yourself pretty low on your characters. Because this team, especially when you're too lazy to actually level up your Toma skill and burst, you deal more damage to yourself than Toma's shield can handle, which means that over an infinite amount of time, you're HP negative. So Prototype Amber kind of fixes that, but because there's only 3 chambers and you kill enemies pretty damn fast, I haven't found that to be too big of an issue. But if that's something that you're struggling with, then Prototype Amber on Nahida can fix that. And then obviously, Xingqiu. He's on Sack Sword again. He doesn't need to be on Sack Sword. He could get away with a non-ER weapon, but I like the additional comfort of having more energy generation and the flexibility it provides for teams like this. So that's that for the builds. So stay tuned for the next Meta Roundup next batch, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye, YouTube.